Good morning. Thank you, Steve, for another great children's message. I'm glad you are with us as we're going through this new study on parental concerns. This is from Proverbs, the 23rd chapter, verses 19 through 26. If you haven't read that, I encourage you to do so. I like coming-of-age stories. Some of my favorite were written by G.A. Henty, a British author who wrote in the late 1800s. He saw a great many young men making poor choices as a country at that time because they had no one advising them otherwise, because they had, in general, turned away from the church, as had their parents. His idea to help these young, wayward men was to write historical adventures in which a young man, not unlike themselves, had to decide how they would act. At a time when entertainment options were live theater, books, or stories told down at the local pub, the majority of these young men were looking for something interesting to read. Henty's history was accurate, his adventures exciting, and his truth biblical. So his books were very popular. He portrayed the consequences of both godly and self-serving choices in a way that he hoped would compel these young men to choose God's ways. In all, he wrote 122 of these books, but if you decide to read one, let me remind you that he is not a modern author, so he lacks modern political correctness and perspective. His vocabulary, his stock characters, and his British nationalism is considered by some to be offensive. But despite this caveat, I still like them because he advocates making godly choices, which is still the kind of thing that we who are parents want our own children to do. According to the proverb that we read earlier, it seems that this was also the kind of thing that Solomon wanted his own son to do. But instead of writing adventure novels, he wrote Proverbs. The whole of chapter 23 is about making godly choices. If you haven't read it in a while, I encourage you to read the entire chapter. Solomon began by warning his son about leaders who would try to gain influence over him by feeding him well. It is not unlike the modern proverb, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Then Solomon spoke to his son about the poor choices that result when your desire is simply to gain wealth. We might say today that the end doesn't justify the means. Solomon also warned his son about following the counsel of false friends, whose advice would really benefit themselves and not his son. He told him in the same breath how only a fool despises godly counsel, and that since he would become king, he needed to remember that rulers were not above the law and should respect the rights of their own people, not overburdening them. Otherwise, they just might rebel. Solomon did not want his son to envy the momentary pleasures that are enjoyed by sinners because they lead to ruin. Instead, Solomon wanted him to live in the fear of the Lord. Throughout this chapter, especially towards the end of it, Solomon warned his son with several good examples to be very, very careful about the company he kept. He was to avoid heavy drinkers, gluttonous eaters of meat, and prostitutes. We might say that bad company corrupts good morals. These are all good lessons that every parent would want to pass along to their children, or at least I hope that every parent would want to do so. But if all you had to go on was this proverb, you might think that Solomon wanted to be that father and he wanted his wife to be that mother who could brag about their son, telling stories of how he was making good choices and that was resulting in good things both for himself, his family, and his people. We get the distinct impression from this proverb that Solomon didn't want to have these stories to share out of a selfish motive. He didn't want to imply that his son was so successful because he and his wife were such amazing parents. Solomon wanted God to receive the credit. So we can surmise that Solomon, being a godly man himself, knew that this would only happen if his son followed God's ways, adhering to his wisdom and following his instructions. So we are told that Solomon made an incredibly huge ask. He wanted his son's heart, and he boldly asked for it in verse 26. The Hebrew translated heart is used 573 times in the Old Testament, and 97 of those are used in the book of Proverbs. What one chooses really is a matter of the heart. Of course, the way that we would phrase this question today is, have you given your heart to Jesus? We might be good examples for our children to follow, but we, generally speaking, are also well aware that we are far from being the best example. If our children are going to follow someone, we'd rather it be Jesus than ourselves. And Jesus, like Solomon, was not above making that big ask himself. He asked each of his disciples, "Come and follow me." And he also let them know that it would be difficult to keep following him, saying things like, if you want to be my disciples, you have to take up your cross and follow me. And expressing that if a person was not willing to leave it all behind, then they were not fit to be his disciples. And he asked them, when others were leaving out of disillusionment, if they too wanted to call it quits. The Apostle Paul seems to have softened that call to follow just a little. He said that if following Jesus seemed like too much of an ask, then he wanted those to whom he wrote to do their best to follow his own example, because he was following Jesus so they would end up going in the right direction. His challenge made me think again about Solomon's request that his son give him his heart, that his son follow his own example. When we compare the proverb to the story of Solomon's life found in the Old Testament, a very different picture emerges. There is no doubt that Solomon wanted the best for his son, Rehoboam, but despite this proverb and others like it that Solomon wrote, his own choices spoke louder than his words. Did you realize that the scriptures only mention that Solomon had one son? Given that he had 1,000 women in his harem, concubines and wives combined, you would expect more children to be mentioned, even if he only visited each of those women in his harem at their initiation, and there was only a 1 in 25 chance of them conceiving by that encounter. Solomon should have, at the very minimum, about 40 children, but none are mentioned except Rehoboam. There is a lot of speculation as to what may have happened to these unmentioned children. The most probable and most horrific is that Solomon's heart was turned away from God by his foreign wives. It's 1 Kings 11:3 and 4. To please them, he built temples to their pagan gods and joined them in worshiping these gods. It has also been substantiated that these gods were primarily worshipped by offering their infants to them, who would be burned up in the flames of the sacrifice. This unthinkable behavior is part of the reason that God brought his judgment against Solomon. It ends up that he wasn't so wise after all. And as a result, God told him that most of his kingdom would not pass on to his son Rehoboam, but to another, to Jeroboam, who was not in his family. And the only reason that all of this kingdom was not being taken away from him and his family was to honor Solomon's father, King David, who despite his failures was a man after God's own heart. Solomon's death came, and his son Rehoboam took over as king. And Jeroboam, along with the leaders of the 10 northern tribes, came to Rehoboam and asked for relief from his father's taxation and his building projects. But Rehoboam, on the advice of his so-called friends, rejected that request and actually raised the taxes. It was the proverbial last straw. The northern tribes broke away and they formed their own country. They took the name Israel to identify themselves and made Jeroboam their king. Rehoboam was left with only 2 tribes, and his country became known as Judah. And this was the beginning of the divided kingdom. Jeroboam was afraid that his people would go down to Jerusalem and worship, and while there they would end up reestablishing their allegiance to Rehoboam. So he developed a whole new religion for the northern kingdom, leading them further and further away from God. As for the south, Rehoboam, like his father Solomon, was busy leading his own people further away from God by advocating worship in the pagan temples that his father had built to please his mother. If you didn't know, Rehoboam's mother was the daughter of an Ammonite priest, and she had a lot of influence over both Solomon and Rehoboam. It was said that Rehoboam, that he did evil because he did not set his heart on God. You can find that in 1 Kings 14:21 and 2 Chronicles 12:14. In comparison to his father, Rehoboam had a modest harem. He only had 18 wives and 60 concubines, but he ended up with 28 sons and 60 daughters. These children were spared because they were in Judah, and the priests faithful to the one true God advocated and enacted a law that if any person whose seed was offered up to one of the pagan gods, that person would be put to death, even if they were king. But let's get back to Solomon's proverb. It presents a more comfortable image of Solomon and his parenting skills than the stories that we read about him in the Old Testament. In this proverb, we find an ideal father and an ideal mother asking their son to give them his heart that he might follow in their footsteps and become the ideal son. Solomon got what he wanted. The unfortunate truth is that Rehoboam did follow in their footsteps, but those footsteps led away from God rather than toward him. But still, when we read this proverb, we want to be more like the father and mother it holds up as an example. We really do want the very best for our children. We want them to embrace godly wisdom and to follow godly instructions. We'd like for them to make even better choices than we ourselves have made. We know all too well that our children will make mistakes along the way, as all of us do. But the fewer the mistakes and the less costly the mistakes, the better. And we know that this will only happen if our children commit themselves to loving the Lord with their heart, their soul, their mind, their strength, and loving their neighbors as themselves. Like Rehoboam, our children will look at our own example. The do as I say and not as I do style of parenting is not a very effective one. By and large, the proverbial apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So the first and best step of becoming a good parent is to give your own heart to Jesus. Then we need to follow Jesus' example and parent by grace. If you have a less than ideal child, one who is prone to wander, you still need to make that huge ask in regard to their heart, just as Jesus asked his own disciples to follow him. There is no guarantee how they will answer that question. Some will follow, but others, perhaps even the majority of them, may not. Jesus said that the road that led toward him is narrow and difficult, and the way that leads away from him is wide and easy. If they choose the wrong way, it doesn't mean that you are a bad parent any more than that Jesus is a bad Lord. I was one of those wayward children. I was very happy following the wide and easy way. I enjoyed the company that was on it, and as a result, I was getting into more and more trouble. Of course, at the time, I didn't think it was trouble. I thought it was how you were supposed to enjoy life. And God, if anything, was simply getting in the way of me having a good time. And I didn't like anyone telling me otherwise. My mother and stepfather saw the truth, and they did what they could to turn me away from my foolish ways. At one point, they decided that it would be good for me to attend Bill Gothard's Institute of Basic Youth Conflicts. I was furious at them for requiring me to go, but I went. I mean, what was I going to do? It wasn't like I really had a choice. And it was a week-long event. And we attended every session. And I hated every second of it. I didn't run down to the front and rededicate my life to Jesus. I didn't respond to my parents when they tried to talk to me about what was said in the sessions. And when it was over, I didn't stop running around with the wrong crowd. But it was there at that conference that the big ask was made to me. It came when Bill Gothard showed a drawing of a throne, and with all sorts of things pictured around it. Several were the kinds of things that I was happily doing, but his question was this: who do you want on the throne of your heart? He went on to explain what would happen one by one when each of those various things was in charge of your life. And he didn't paint a pretty picture of what was going to happen when the wrong thing was in charge of your life. And I didn't want to believe him. But there was a time, and that's another story for another sermon, that I came to realize that he was right, and how much better my life would be if I let Jesus be the one who was on the throne of my heart. I'd had enough of all the problems that I had invited into my life. I'd reached a point that I was pretty miserable, and I finally decided to give my whole heart to Jesus and follow him alone. It was not an easy thing to do, and it was amazing how my life changed. It changed for the better, just as was promised, and it still is. You and your children will give your heart to someone or to something. And if you don't ask them to give it to Jesus, or you don't ask yourself to give it to Jesus, who will? And just in case you're wondering, yes, there is a way to tell whether you or your children have really given your heart to Jesus. It's not by the absence of difficult situations or by the presence of them, for that matter. It is by what you say. It is about what you treasure. And it's about whose commands you obey in the midst of any and every situation. These three things are things that Jesus himself said reveal what is in our hearts. I would be remiss if I did not remind you that it is our Heavenly Father who asks the big question of you. He wants you to give him his heart. The question is whether you will. Like me, you may have been asked before, but you didn't give it to him at the time. I still have that old manual that we got at that basic Institute of Youth Conflicts, and I was surprised when I opened it up not only to see my name tag still in it, but I took pretty good notes. But I didn't listen to the wisdom of it. But I did hear the question, and it just took me a while to give my final answer. And I want to challenge you to give your final answer too, and I hope and pray that it is to give Jesus your heart. We had a baptism this week, a young man named Travis, who has been going through that process of giving his heart to Jesus. And he shared his journey with our young adult group last Tuesday night. And he gave his heart to the Lord. He was ready to let the old die and the new be born again. He'd gone through and he had read every place in the Bible where the scriptures speak about baptism. He heard, he believed, he confessed, he's repented, and he's ready to live the Christian life under the influence and power of the Spirit. And so I hope as you watch this next video of his baptism, that you ask yourself that question that God is placing on you. Have you given your heart to Jesus? Are you ready for a new start that leads to a better life? I hope your answer is yes. Jesus, I am ready to follow you.